Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Beyond the Ice Walls Second Ring series. This is Italian P&C speaking to you, and once again we're back on this beautiful map of a journey that we started so much time ago. As I said, this is the 12th episode of looking at all these continents, islands, places, regions, polities, and whatsoever that are shown in this map. For those that were not here before, well, let me quickly explain what we're looking at. This is a differently projected map of the world that shows the entirety of the Earth as we know it, completely surrounded by the ice walls. These ice walls, of course being Antarctica, are what divides the world we know from the world that is unknown to us. In the first series we went and looked at, we learned about what was in Atlas. Atlas being this entire area that is shown in this map, inside of this other ring. And then after the mountain ring, we started looking, in the series we're doing right now, at Akupara, aka everything that is inside this second ring. As you can see, there's so many continents, regions, places that are unknown and that have been talked about in the past, such as Asgard, Anubis, Aten, Awas, Waldhelm, even things like Atlantis right here, or places like Torrid. But today, we are gonna go and see something a bit different. In fact, although the majority of this series was spent looking at continents and learning about all these places that are basically very prevalent and noticeable on the map, we've kind of skipped, or rather just not really pushed to our interests, or rather just not prioritized these lesser island chains that are seen in this part of the map. In fact, on this video, we will focus exactly on that. We'll do the islands of the Torrential Ocean, as well as talk about the Tiffinstorm right here and the Abyssal Ocean, part of the wastes of the map. So, first of all, did I say wastes? Do you guys know what those are? Well, if you've been here so far, you probably have an idea of what they are, but I really never went too much into depth about these wastes. Although some of them had lore to them that explained very deeply, like in the case of the Titanic forests, or of course of the walls of Asgard, but there are some examples, or I guess even the Scorched Wastes with a ram, and yet there are some examples of these wastes that really don't have so much lore to know, and you don't really understand what wastes even are. Like, why are they called wastes? The easiest explanation is that a waste is something that is not traversable and is like impossible or very hard or useless to reach as humans or any other creature. But the reality is that the wastes are a bit more interesting than that. In fact, if we go a bit south and we reach the wastes that we're closer to now, we've been going clockwise from the start in this area right here of the map. Right after the mountain ring, we start with Weldrum, this continent right here, and we kept going up, 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 and then right, and then south. This is the direction we've been going at, and we've seen all these wastes, but we never really explained exactly what they are. I mean, maybe you guess, like, volcanic waste has to be, volcanic ashes and all that, but what are wastes? Well, the area that we're looking at right now, the Abyssal Ocean and the Tiffinstorm, are a bit different, yet they still count as wastes of the map. These are distinct, expansive environments where the laws of physics are their weakest. The line between the possible and impossible will start to blur, almost as if you entered a state of hallucination just by being here. Which means that while normally these places could just seem like complete wastes of time even, just because they just seem like natural phenomenon, like, a storm or an ocean, when you actually reach them as people, like as a human, you reach them, you start to see things, you start to notice things that aren't really supposed to be there. We've seen the fact that the volcanic wastes right here have this effect on the mind where it can kind of like create hallucinations, or rather, well, not really hallucinations, but it can give these kind of effects that aren't supposed to happen, It can make you see things. And of course, we've seen in the case of the Titanic forest that there's actually possibility of beings actually existing in these wastes. But what happens when something else exists in one of these wastes? Well, this is the case for the Tiffinstorm. That is basically the biggest storm ever created. You could really compare it to the Eye of Jupiter if you had to compare it on a celestial scale. But it being a waste doesn't mean that it's completely void of life. In fact, thoughts and spirits navigate the waters and the wastes that are shown in the map and are almost as physically real as those who enter them, although each waste presents their own quirks. As I said, although some wastes have obviously some, relation to actual phenomena like environmental phenomena, like volcanic wastes obviously has volcanoes. We've seen the scorched waste obviously have desert. There are some aspects that link them together, which one of them is this, this, you could say this vicinity to the world, the spirit world, or just spirituality in itself. In the case of the Tiffinstorm, once you reach the Tiffinstorm and the abyssal ocean, you go all the way into basically the end of the world, as one could say. Of course, that's not really it, there's more to it, but you wouldn't know, because of course there's the end of this map. Once you reach that, you will start seeing things. But what are these things? Creatures akin to monsters and sightings of even aliens have made the visiting of wastes extremely dangerous and discouraged. People that went to the wastes have seen things that could just be interpreted as their own thoughts made reality, or creatures that could only be described as monsters, or in another case, the aliens that everybody talks about, like the Greys, for example. So it seems like the wastes are almost like a barrier to the other worlds, or other, planes of existences, planets, whatever you want to call them, and the things that come into the world that we know are things that come through the wastes. Once one of these monstrous beings escapes the wastes, it can have lasting effects on the geography and environment of the continent it makes its landing into. We have an example of this in one of the continents that, or rather, I don't know if you could really call it a continent, I guess it's an island, but the size, if you compare it to like what is inside of the ice walls, you could kind of make an argument for it if it was like a really small continent. I would still prefer to just call it an island. We're talking about the island of Laala, or also known as the Slumbering Giant. There's a reason it's called the Slumbering Giant, and the reason for it is that the creation of this island was made once one of these monstrous entities, literally just a giant from the outside world, entered through the Tiffinstorm and reached Akupara, or the second ring. After a certain amount of time, of course, the different environment, atmosphere and whatever just caused him to die, and he became the continent of Laala. Of course, there was land already there, so he was like kind of, created into the continent, possibly becoming one of its peaks, like for example this mountain right here. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be the continent itself or just one of the places inside of it, but either way, I think it's really fascinating that you've seen this a lot in mythology and like tales of the ancients about giants just, being part of a landscape. If I believe correctly, in Norse mythology, you would have kind of this situation where the original giants, whose flesh, blood, and eyes were like the starting points of the universe. And they had like this kind of motif of like the mountains being sleeping and slumbering giants. So I can kind of understand what they're going for. And it is interesting that, according to this map's lore, we have a similar situation with Laala. So yeah, the Tiffinstorm is like, I guess, just a storm when it comes to its own quirk. Obviously, it will be like the biggest storm ever, and it will be almost impossible to reach. So even if you reach something like the Tiffinstorm, it's basically impossible. You wouldn't even be able to enter it. You'll be destroyed the moment you even go to its outer rims. And of course, same thing goes for the volcanic wastes. You would be freezing in the frozen wastes. So it's almost like they're testing you. It's almost like they were like another wall put upon you, just so it is impossible to go even further than the second ring. Well, I'm not here to tell you go outside of the second ring. I don't even know what is there, because obviously this map's lore ends with it. Maybe someday we'll know about the third ring, if it even exists. Let's go back to these little islands and continents that we're gonna focus on today. As I said, today will all be about the Torrential Ocean and all the islands and archipelagos that are near it, with one exception being New Torrid, which I don't know, but it might be what I think it is, and if it is, I want to have it for a separate video. You guys already know with the word torrid. If you know, you know. With that said, let's get back to these little islands and archipelagos. Let's start with one of the ones that I had the least information on. Probably no, literally the one I had basically nothing on. I looked it up on everywhere. I couldn't find the lore for the like in the map and the like posts, anything. And when I looked it up online, it is weird that this happened, but it actually sent me to the wiki page for Lost and Phantom Islands, which is really interesting because when I skimmed or rather read the wiki, I couldn't find a single mention of anything called Lucisha. So how was it even possible that just typing Lucisha brought me there? Either way, I'm not sure, but it is interesting that this is considered one of these phantom islands. It is called the Painted Islands, and I assume it is because of its geography. As you can see, you can kind of see, even it just by looking at it, that it has a multitude of biomes even on these small islands, and you can kind of understand how it could be called painted, because it kind of looks like you had a brush and you put all these colors with it. There is like a continuation of mountains inside this area right here in the northern island. There's also some sort of tropical forest all around these like eastern parts. Then there's, I believe, some sort of desert in the middle, plains, and even some sort of, well, I guess with all these lakes it would be some sort of swamp too. So I guess that's why it's called the Painted Islands. But apart from that, I really couldn't find anything on this. So I'm sorry if we're starting with one I'm least informed on, but I kind of wanted to do this one quickly because I really didn't have anything on it. If you guys know anything about Lucisha, let me know, because I'm interested in learning more about it. Also, reminder to subscribe to the channel and like the video if you're enjoying this content, or if you've been a long time viewer. A lot of you guys tend to miss out on notifications because I know YouTube kind of like is not great with them. So if you want to keep learning and watching the series, I suggest you do activate notifications once you're subscribed. With that said, let's go back to what we were doing. The second place we'll talk about today is Spreinesia, probably the most detailed one I have for today. Spreinesia is an archipelago that is right off the western coast of Horus. Horus, the Great Pillars of Akupara, is a continent we've looked at and discovered about 2 episodes ago, if I remember correctly. It is very huge and has a lot to do with Egyptian mythology, while Spreinesia really has no correlation with it. Let's talk about this little island chain. Well, it's not really little, it really seems to be just 3 islands, and you can just see, even just by the kind of geography and the way these islands are colored, that there's something going on with this kind of formations. So these islands possess properties that immensely alter even the most simple components of human technology. The people of Spreinesia, who find their origins in antediluvian times, that being the times before the big mud floods or floods, created one of the ancient semi-advanced civilizations outside of the ice walls and the mountain ring, which means that the little islands of Spreinesia were one of the earliest settlements of humans outside of the ice walls. We've seen how there are tales of non-human beings, like our related hominid kind of beings, living outside of the ice walls even before humans, but when it comes to humans, these were one of the first places that people got to. And it is interesting how they developed in these islands. All traces of pre-advanced civilizations are erased from history here, making finding archaeological proof of its existence impossible. This is because the people of Spreinesia kind of hate the past. They hate the concept of history, and they erase it every generation that goes. Thus, old Sprenesians can reinvent customs and society from the start every generation that lives, which also causes them to consider the past more like a fairy tale than reality. This means that although they create structures and they have, kind of buildings, they destroy it and mow it down every single time that a generation passes. Which means that in some way, if they go extinct, there will be no trace of them whatsoever. And I believe this is the thing that makes studying Spreinesia so hard for explorers. But then there's the aspect that we have not mentioned, the geographical one. This relates to what the islands actually look like, and we can actually see a little bit of it right here on the description of the islands. The Isles of the Rainbow Mists. Why are these called like that? Well, these islands are shrouded in this thick, dense mists that completely surround them and create a very pluvial and tropical, but not in the good way. I mean, like tropical in the sense that humidity is out of the roof. This creates this sort of environment where, advancing as a civilization is harder than it seems. You can't really destroy trees and do everything because it keeps raining, there's monsoons, there's mist, and also fun fact, or rather not really so fun as much as an effect itself, is the fact that this humidity and this mist is actually filled with bacteria. insanely filled with germs and bacteria. In fact, once a foreigner arrives to Spreinesia, if it ever happened, he would basically instantly die at first contact with this mist, because although the people of Spreinesia evolved in time to resist this kind of bacteria, everybody else would have a different outcome. You can kind of see a parallel to this as the natives of the New World once Columbus arrived, although in that case it was the people arriving that brought the illnesses with them and created the mass death that killed off the majority of the population of the Americas in the subsequent centuries. Whilst in this case, it would be more of the opposite. You arrive there, you die. Your crew dies, everybody dies. And your history is just removed because of the people's traditions. Also, the density of this mist and humidity creates a situation where fire is impossible to create, or rather very, very difficult, unless it creates spontaneously, like with a lightning. Which means that obviously these people had to create a whole culture that advanced, as I said, but without the use of fire, which is considered by most people one of the most important advancements that humans ever reached in their history. This made it so that they had to cook without fire, so they use salt instead of fire to conserve food. They have to just make it so that their culture and their food and everything that revolves around their living situation has to avoid fire, because it can't be really kept alive with this humidity. So Spreinesia civilization is really interesting because it is really unique for this reason. And in one sense, this could also explain how they were not really conquered or bothered by the people that are in Horus, or even the newcoming humans that arrived later, or maybe even the people that were before the humans, or whatever other creature that lives in Akupara. So that is the lore of Spreinesia. I find it really interesting, and the concept of this rainbow mists that kind of shroud the islands really remind me of the lost islands that we've seen in the last video, like Brazil, where we've seen how this island was always shrouded in mist, and that made it so that some people didn't really understand if it existed or it didn't exist. We made a whole video on it. I suggest you go watch it. It's really interesting, and I think it deserves more attention because honestly, it was good. It was good. With that said, let's move to the next continent, or archipelago. Now let's do the Ascending Isles. These islands are a series of large plateaus that divide the Torrential Ocean from the Sea of Shadows. In fact, if we zoom out, we can really see how there are division. Basically, almost a perfect division between the two places. But how are they? Well, they're called a stairway to Horus, as each island rises in altitude, the more east into Horus they go, with the last being almost the same height as this continent. So these huge plateaus that are starting from the west and going into the east go and get higher and higher and higher the closer they go to Horus. As we've seen in the case of Horus, it has immense altitude. It is one of the most elevated places in the world. It has these stiff cliffs and all we've seen so far. They also have mountains. The whole pillar of Akupara thing, we've seen it, we've known about it. But the Ascending Isles kind of, link that to the rest of this world. These isles are mostly desertic and uninhabited, as we can see in the area right here. But it is noted that the ones on the eastern part, so the ones closer to Horus, have actually been a decent pit stop port for everybody that wanted to go out from Atlas into Akupara, so out of the second ring, well, not the second ring, out of the mountain ring, reach Akupara and then go east into places like Mu or north in Amun-Ra. So to get there, you kind of had to put a stopover, and what better stopover than the Ascending Isles? Which, of course, with the fact that they're uninhabited, means there was nobody there to attack whoever wanted to travel there, and they could be considered the best place to just stop and, refill your resources, because there is flora in these latter islands compared to these ones in the south. So I guess there should be even some fauna, so some animals that you can kind of catch and eat. Not sure which ones these would be, but it is interesting that it's possible. Let's now move westwards and go into Siwa. So Siwa is kind of small, literally geographically small, and the lore of it is also kind of small. But before we get into it, can I just say that this looks horrible, as an archipelago. It looks, I'm sorry, I'm gonna be honest, this looks like turds. These to me, these look like green turds. I know geography is not subjective, but I think this looks horrible. But with that said, well, it is the home of the Flaming Emperor. There's two versions of this, but basically one goes that these islands have a literal Flaming Emperor that is immortal, kind of, which is considered like one of these pre-human hominids that is like kind of eternal as a way of existing. Or the other way to interpret it is that it has one of those figures which the people that, you know, live there considered immortal. You know how, if I recall correctly, the original president of North Korea is still worshipped as alive by the people of North Korea, even if, of course, he has died for a while now. I'm sorry, North Koreans, don't be mad at me, but I mean, it's kind of true, you know, they're not immortal. Yeah, I'm not sure if this Flaming Emperor is still alive, but who even is he? Well, this archipelago of islands is inhabited by the same ancient Proto-Chinese ethnic group that we saw in another continent in this map, which was Xia. Where is it? Right here, the Palace of the Jade Dragon. We learned about the ancient Chinese dynasty, that like the first Chinese dynasty ever, and how it relates to the continent outside of the ice walls called Xia. And it's noticeable that this wasn't the only place that these people settled. Although obviously they would diverge vastly in the sort of time span that is between the settling and like modern day, and this other place would be Siwa, which would be with this like proto-Chinese colony settler state. These settlers created a unique islander religion that worships their first emperor, Svath, as a divine ruler. So this Flaming Emperor is Svath. It's a divine ruler, they kind of believe this. But also it is noted that they don't really have complex religious mechanics because they don't really have cities or villages, they live in the forest. As you can see, it is very underdeveloped. It's fully pluvial, fully rainforest here, kind of how we've seen with Spreinesia, but the difference is there's no real mist to, you know, cover it all, so they could, you know, create fire and all, but they didn't really advance as a civilization. So while Xia is like this mystical place that unites, you know, Chinese mythology, where is it? I have to always go back to it, but it's the place that unites Chinese mythology, technology, ancient knowledges of the arts and medicine. You know, Siwa is just like this little rotten archipelago of like turd-looking islands that, you know, just stands there, is almost not noteworthy at all compared to the other places that surround it. I mean, we're talking about Laala in the north, New Torrent and Glornia. Like, I think these are more interesting, frankly. But we will see them in the next episode, or actually I'm not really sure if New Torrent and I think the next episode should be New Torrent, Atlantis, and the Sunken Wastes. I think that's what I will go for, but I'm not sure yet. They'll come in a while. So that is as far as Siwa is known about, but we still have one last continent. Well, once again, call it a continent, it's more like a couple islands. And then another interesting thing, we have the Mountains of Kong. So one thing, the Mountains of Kong, I have to be honest, I thought these were in Africa. Like, I've learned about these mountains, forgive me if I'm wrong, I could be wrong, but if I remember correctly, there was this theory that, well, I don't know if you can recall it a theory, but for a long time, a lot of people across the ages, especially the ones that made maps like in Europe or Asia, put a mountain chain right above here. And these were called, if I remember correctly, the Mountains of Kong. And Kong being like a little kingdom that existed, like a chiefdom that existed right up along the coast and inner lands of West Africa. And there's no mountains there as far as we know, although all these maps show them. So there's a theory that basically they did exist, and then for some geological activity they ceased to exist, or maybe it was just misplaced knowledge of the geography of the time. But yeah, in this map of the Beyond the Ice Wall second ring, you know, experience, we have the Mountains of Kong right outside of the ice walls. So could the explanation be that these mountains literally teleported into the second ring instead of remaining in Africa? I'm not sure, but whatever it is interesting that these are the highest peaks outside of the mountain ring. I'm not even kidding, these are the tallest mountains ever. They are volcanic in nature, and they are incredibly high peaks, the highest on average in the entire second ring. They are a natural formation that erupts into height from the ocean, and the mountains start underwater too. So imagine it kind of like all those places that have these like massive volcanoes that start underwater and then they start blowing up and erupting all the way. So in time, they kind of like become taller and taller and taller. That's the situation with the mountains of Kong, except they did it for so long that they became basically the tallest things to exist in the entire second ring. And they're going against places like the Pillars of Akupara, Amura, like there's so many tall continents in terms of altitude, and yet the tallest mountains are the mountains of Kong. So with that said, it is also noticeable that these islands are too steep for any animal or other being to settle them, which means that the only thing that really lives on them is lichen and moss and maybe some plants. But yeah, it's basically impossible to actually reach them and like settle them and create colonies on them, or even just a city. It's just too difficult. And also they're volcanic, so imagine them kind of like Hawaii, but if Hawaii was so like more like the Everest, but even taller than the Everest, that for some reason nobody could live there. It's kind of weird when you think about it, but it could be. And you can kind of see this in the geography as well. Like these obviously are supposed to be like mountains by themselves, like all these brown things, but also these little islands are probably like smaller ones. It's interesting. It's definitely interesting. We have one last place to talk about in this episode, and it is the one that I did not find anything on, and yet I think I know what this is. This is Psychinographa, the Phantom Library. So, as far as we've seen, I tried to catch all the right information about the Ascending Islands, Siwa, Laala, Lucisha, Spreinesia, the Mountains of Kong, etc., etc. But when it comes to I can't even pronounce this, Psychinographa, I wasn't really sure what this was, but the name of the place, or rather the description of it, the Phantom Library, opened my mind. Like literally I was thinking, oh, I think I get this, So we've seen how moving islands are a recurring theme in the Beyond the Ice Walls map. We've seen this especially with the continent of Thought, which is literally called the Nomad Continent, kind of like a description of it, so you kind of have to believe that it is a moving continent. And we've seen this again and again in other examples across the map, and of course I think Psychinographa is one of these examples. But the thing is, I think this is not as much as a moving continent as much as a phantom continent, which means that it appears and it disappears, like straight up disappears, kind of like how people thought places like Brazil did, exist and not exist at times, kind of like they were in one world and another world simultaneously. This is the thing that I think Psychinographa is related to. So what I think this is a collection of islands that hold a deep and vast collection of knowledge that relates to basically everything in existence, and it is held in these sort of like self-generating libraries, almost as they were put there by a higher functioning being, almost like a god or something like that. Of course, I'm not saying this is the case, but I've seen this trope in multiple series, and one thing I can say is that this concept of a phantom library appearing and disappearing in case of need is not original to this map, and I've actually seen it in one other thing that I've watched. Of course, this is not related to the Beyond the Ice Walls lore, but it is something that made me think of that when I was looking into this continent, or chain of islands, and that is the Castlevania show on Netflix, the animated one, where they had this thing called the Infinite Corridor, which would appear only once a person would travel into like dimensions and time, and this Infinite Corridor was basically a self-generating infinite corridor made with library shelves, like constantly creating more and more knowledge as it existed, writing down everything that ever happened, would happen, could happen, it's just everything. Basically, the extent of knowledge you could get from here, you would go crazy before you actually, grow old and die just by being in this Phantom Library. So this Phantom Library could be considered in two ways. It's either something like this, where you walk into the Phantom Library and you absorb its knowledge and maybe you go away and you never find it again and you don't even know what happened, or it's like a trap. It brings you there, it lures you with the concept of infinite knowledge, and then you're trapped there forever because it disappears from the map. You can never go back. Either way, I think it is truly, truly fascinating, and probably one of the most interesting places in a map, if it is interpreted correctly. Once again, not a little lore written down on this one, so I had to improvise with my theories. I hope I went as close as I could. So with that said, this is where I'll end the video when it comes to these specific islands. I hope I interested you with these descriptions and informations, and I tingled your brain into processing them and finding your solutions just by yourselves. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and once again, like the video, subscribe, put hype on the video, this new thing YouTube has. I've said this 3 times already. I have no clue how much I'll have to say because nobody does this. I don't even know if it's relevant. I think I looked into it and it's not even relevant, so whatever, do what you want. You know, put the hype or not put the hype, whatever you want to do. Just enjoy the video, and I hope we see each other next time. Thank you for watching, see you.